Welcome back. It's Thursday History, the history of mental health and psychology. This is the monthly episode that is available to all listeners and anyone out there in the world who clicks on this. Of course, there is weekly history dives into the history of mental health, psychology, and such for patrons of the show who join through our Patreon. But there's once a month where a very special episode will be available to everyone. I wanted to make this topic the one for y'all everybody's because it comes up in a couple of upcoming interviews all about trauma and trauma treatment. We're going to be talking about a trauma narrative. This is something that many people find to be not as useful as it was, or at least not as universal when you go to therapy. Focused on overcoming trauma. The trauma narrative used to be almost always a part of that, and still, of course, is a part of cognitive behavioral therapy's approach to dealing with trauma. There are many other more trauma-informed treatments that are out there nowadays, such as EDMR and IFS. That's internal family systems. We talk about those quite a bit on the program because trauma is our friend as a topic. Not really our friend, but trauma is there, and we talk about it quite a bit on the show. But I want to talk about some of the reasons why some people consider a trauma narrative not as in vogue, I guess, as often, and some of the things about it that are just, helpful to people when they use one. So we're going to get into this. This is a very important part of mental health therapy, and you might find that if you haven't been to therapy working on trauma, you might still have the idea that this is a universal part of recovery from trauma, which it is not anymore. In essence, the definition of a trauma narrative is writing down and speaking aloud the story of the traumatic event, whether it's combat-related trauma, whether it's an accident or near-death experience, whether it is abuse of one kind or another, whatever the trauma is. A trauma narrative would be telling the story of the trauma, which is generally done several times over the course of therapy. It's something that you talk about in therapy. It's something that if you're doing this narrative the way it's traditionally done, you're also going to write down the story. And then you might toss that one and write it again, and then you might even do it again. And basically the idea is exposure to the story and to the memory of the trauma until it accommodates into our life and is not quite such an overwhelming thing. Now, this is usually coupled with cognitive techniques to be able to calm, to be able to moderate the emotional response. We'll get into some of that, but that would be considered the first part of a cognitive behavioral approach to trauma. There's assessment, there's setting goals, but then there's learning how to mitigate or moderate an emotional reaction before getting into the exposure. This is also inherent to exposure therapy, a cognitive behavioral technique to get over other forms of anxiety triggers, phobias, anything that has a trigger and a response. The first big section of cognitive behavioral therapy, which sets you up to make the exposure or other interventions even possible, or let's say even safe to do, is training in how to regulate your thoughts, beliefs, and emotions through thought and behavioral exercises, cognitive behavioral therapy. The belief being, of course, that if you cannot mitigate or moderate the overwhelming emotional responses you are already having, then you are not ready to really face the trauma. The other side of that is the philosophy and belief that if you don't face the trauma and process it and be exposed to it until it becomes a normal part of your life, or at least part of your story that isn't so challenging, then there's other anxieties and things you will be subject to them, and you will be trying to deal with them, hopefully better, with the tools you gained. But it will help more to process through that until it's not an issue anymore that triggers quite so often or quite so intensely. If you go back in time, a lot of trauma research, when it started to become a thing that people noticed, actually goes back to World War II times, where at that time and before that, there was a term called shell shock that they applied to combat veterans who were having emotional regulation problems, specifically and especially after returning home from those things. World War II saw a whole lot of people who were having tremendous psychological issues, so much so that the hospitals would be full of people who were seeing psychiatrists and psychologists, and it became something that was starting to be studied, and eventually that's where the diagnosis that we still use today of PTSD was developed. Around the early 2000s, they started to use the exposure therapy techniques, which is really where trauma narrative eventually came from, in order to face that and try to, once again, moderate and reduce how triggering and how much those feelings and triggers could impair someone's life. It was around that same time in 2001 that trauma-informed care started to be a thing. That's TIC. And quite a while before it caught on. But it was sometime between then and the 2010s that it started to become something that was discussed quite a bit, which is your treatment program or your treatment approach trauma-informed? And that became a big part of trainings. There are lots of books that started applying that, and a very useful perspective to be able to bring that into it. Like so many things in so many industries, it ran the risk of becoming a bit of a buzzword of saying like, oh, we're trauma informed. And the biggest change people would do is they would start adding the words trauma informed to whatever ads or materials that they said about their agency or their practice. Luckily, there's also been a lot of training and research in different therapy techniques that actually tie in with this trauma information and trauma understanding. And so, therefore that's a little bit better now. Trauma-informed care would make an interesting little rabbit hole. You guys know I love to tell you little rabbit holes that you may want to dive down on the internet if you're interested in this stuff. But the history of trauma-informed care is one of those. Now, one aspect of this, by the way, is narrative therapy. I said a minute ago that exposure therapy was applied to trauma a little bit more starting in the 2000s because trauma was being discussed more. Now, I don't want to say that it wasn't used at all before then. Trauma narratives and telling a story can actually go back to the 70s and 80s, where narrative therapy was an approach that was thought of. And it was thought of to be different, although it definitely is related to cognitive therapy because it has to do with telling your story and facing things through a narrative and looking at what is the story that you're experiencing. So deep dive into narrative therapy is a look for another day, but that does pair with the time where PTSD, I should say, PTSD, by the way, became an official diagnosis in 1980. And originally it was thought to be basically combat or life-threatening events only. In fact, you can see where there was an attitude, even of mockery, of what they might call secondary trauma that you get from being a caregiver of someone with trauma, or trauma from abuse and things. Just wasn't discussed as much. I remember a Saturday Night Live sketch in the 80s or early 90s. I wouldn't have been watching Saturday Night Live much by the end of the 80s, personally, just because of age. But in the 90s, I remember there being a little sketch or joke where they had an ad, and the very talented Phil Hartman came on and played the part of an attorney who was like an ambulance chasing attorney with this ad that was like, I'm going to sue someone for you, basically, and obviously for comedic purposes. But one of the things he said was, have you been involved in an accident? Have you almost had an accident? Have you experienced lots of stress from hearing about an accident? Now, at that point, that was the joke, right? We don't joke as much about that today because we do understand that trauma is relative and people do experience different forms of trauma from different stimuli. If you have a perspective of trauma, then you are likely to have some symptoms of trauma. Most of the time, trauma does not lead to full-blown PTSD. Anybody has PTS. And as I like to always point out, the D is not always present in every case. So if you have trauma, you're going to have post-traumatic stress, generally speaking, to some level. Some people are naturally more or less resistant to this having a long-term effect in their day-to-day life. And that just seems to be, I don't know, there's environmental factors. Obviously, there's genetics involved in that. There's what kind of experiences do we have, and how young we were and how often we were exposed to trauma does seem to associate with certain structures in the brain, the amygdala, for example, becoming bigger or stronger. We basically develop more of a hair trigger for trauma depending on life experience. But just as everyone has PTS, within some months from the trauma occurring, if we start to have a regular impairment, if we have or continue to have the frequency and intensity during the trauma or right after, and it just isn't getting better, that's where we add the D, which stands for disorder, and you get into that. So that's a little bit about trauma and why was this so important for people to start applying therapies to it. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy has long and for a long time was considered the gold standard of any, of types of therapy that you would be doing. This is what we also traditionally now call talk therapy quite a bit as well. With cognitive behavioral therapy, you are trying to access the emotions and the feelings with the thought process that you can intervene with your, once again, actions and thoughts. As opposed to old style psychoanalysis where you would spend a long time doing their form of analysis is talk therapy that's meant to get at some of the underlying roots, sort of figure out what's going on in the subconscious and to affect the subconscious. Now, the subconscious is not available to us. That's why it's called subconscious. Cognitive behavioral therapy traditionally does not really take the idea of a subconscious. In fact, when I was in my very first psychology classes that I ever took at a little community college in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, my first psychology professor I had was very much a cognitive behaviorist, and he talked about how he personally didn't feel there was any evidence that a subconscious even exists. I don't hear that debate as much today. I think that there's been, as so many things, there's a balance where we embrace different levels of consciousness. But either way, cognitive behavioral therapy was not as worried about the subconscious, but it was, like many therapies, very focused on the effects, and sometimes, as we're going to talk about the story, of trauma and of early childhood experiences and things such as that. One of the ongoing things that's very important in cognitive behavioral therapy is cognition, which is our thoughts. It's right in the name, right? And the experience with trauma will often lead us to have lots of different thoughts, and we start to form we start to form schemas and ideas and definitions about the world around us, and we have repetitious, or rather repetition of thoughts that we have. And when there is trauma and anxiety and adrenaline and all these things attached to it, those thoughts can feel very automatic, and they can also become very invasive to where we are trying not to have them, but they are still being had. So the approach with cognitive behavioral therapy is often to interrupt those thoughts, to replace them with other things, or basically, in this case, to expose ourselves to them until they don't have as much power. One of the things that people really like about cognitive behavioral therapy is it does feel empowering to say you can do structured exercises that will impact the way that you feel and you'll be happier. And many people, it lends itself to their feelings about what they want out of therapy. They would come in, talk about things very logically, maybe even take worksheets or packets to do in between sessions and those kinds of things. There are certain people who really, really like that a lot better than just kind of talking about their feelings. One of the criticisms of cognitive behavioral therapy that goes along also with rational emotive behavioral therapy and narrative therapy in general is that those therapies can be subject to the biases and attitudes of the clinician. They can also rely heavily on the culture at large where they take place, as far as what are the values and the definitions of what is logical and what is cognitively healthy. The purest definition in psychology of what is a healthy thought is a thought that is both true and useful. But once you get into applying and deciding what is true and what is useful, there are a lot of things to consider that are not always considered historically. One of these has emerged in the last several decades more and more is the thought of cultural diversity and also just different experiences. And cultural can mean along the lines of ethnic, racial terms, but oftentimes is more really focused on, even though those are factors, It's focused on social differences in culture. And you could go as far as to say that each of us has our own culture within our family, and then we have a greater culture or community that we associate or are affiliated with. And then, of course, you have the general culture at large of the country, nation, whatever, where you live. And that oftentimes, and this is a critique of some forms of therapy and some approaches, that's the one we try to match quite often when we're trying to look at what is, quote, healthy. And so that is something we have to be aware of, is if we're working towards a well-balanced, logical approach to mitigating and managing our emotions, we have to question, and maybe should, where does that approach come from? Which has led to more emotionally focused therapies nowadays that aren't as at risk of projecting cultural values into the therapy. So when you have gone through the first section of your therapy and you're learning different techniques to moderate or lower your emotional response, to be able to have less intense reactions that are less overwhelming, and doing practices, many times relaxation techniques, things like that. So when you've gotten through that, you start telling the story. You start diving into this. And one of the things they look for in CBT is they look for what types of words do you use, what types of emotional labeling words, what types of intensity of terminology do you use when you are talking about the event. Am I talking about, if I was involved in a traumatic car accident, do I talk about the cars smashing into each other, the speed that they went? Do I look at the emotions involved in shaming terms, that I failed to stop in time, that I am just an idiot and a dumbass for having the accident in the first place, or I never should have gotten in that car, and all of these types of things. If only, if only, if onlys. Some of those kinds of terminology and language are determined to be very important in how we tell the story to ourselves, because we're essentially telling a story to ourselves whenever we are remembering something. One of the things they look at is the intensity of emotion words, which trauma narratives, and there have been studies that indicate that trauma narratives include a lot more of emotion words than non-trauma narratives when people are talking about other stories that aren't so traumatic in nature. This is another sort of critique that is often leveled at CBT, is the accusation or assertion, if you will, that CBT says that thoughts always precede emotions. Now, I don't know that that's a fair thing to say about every single CBT therapist out there. In fact, in pure CBT, the way I was taught, you've got cognition, behaviors, and emotions, and they often draw them in a triangle and talk about how they interact with each other as well. And once again, what is in our consciousness of our first experience is considered to be important. But it is fair to say that cognitive behavioral approaches do focus very much on the thoughts, and that, once again, as the main intervention. And so when we look at the use of emotion words, and depending on how the therapy is conducted, are those emotion words, sort of that terminology, when we try to manipulate that for a healthy effect, do we fall into, once again, clinician bias or societal bias, or do we just avoid and escape from the emotions a little bit too? That is a risk that is inherent to the way that we approach it, if the goal is to change the emotional experience by thinking about it or talking about it. Now, one of the reasons that they do a lot of prep in therapy and relaxation techniques and things is that when you do get into starting to tell the story and you're analyzing and everything, telling the story can temporarily bring up more triggers and can worsen some of the trauma symptoms that you're experiencing, because you are focusing on it more often. And a good therapist, of course, will prep you for this and talk about how are we going to mitigate that with, once again, it's usually with more of those uses of the techniques and things, and also oftentimes having others in your support circle they know what you're doing and what stage you're in, and those kinds of things. This is not unique to CBT. EMDR practitioners find this as well, and will also prep clients for the fact that in the beginning stages of EMDR, when you're doing first, several sessions, especially, there may be times where outside of session, you're feeling a little bit like some of this trauma's kicked up a little bit. Difference, of course, being there is that the trauma narrative is not considered to be an important part of EMDR. And that's a whole nother thing. You can go back to some of the archives and listen to episodes I've done about EMDR. And I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it, how that is not considered to be an important part, which also gets to one of the bigger problems with trauma-focused narratives when people are having to write the story and tell the story. One of the biggest risks of that, in my experience, is that people don't go to therapy, or they just learn some relaxation techniques and then they stop because they don't want to do the exposure therapy. They don't want to tell the story over and over. And even if you can debate and talk about how much that would or might not be helpful for all people, and how much that maybe they would benefit from it, maybe they wouldn't. But I will tell you 100% of people who stop therapy don't benefit from therapy anymore. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? They can obviously benefit from what they've done before and things that they've learned, but they're not going to have an ongoing experience because they stopped having an ongoing experience. And if I'm tremendously anxious about knowing that I'm going to be asked and expected to do this trauma narrative, and there's no way around that, that is my only definition of health and success, that turns a lot of people away from therapy. Many people don't even start the therapy, so they don't even get the beginning of the cognitive behavioral approach. They won't even start trauma therapy because they have heard about this, or they know that that's going to be expected, or rather believe that it's going to be expected, that you're going to have to tell the story either in some kind of group setting or with your therapist, or write it down a million times. I mentioned support system, and the support system actually plays a really big role in trauma-focused CBT, in that you are actually supposed to identify a safe person that you can eventually tell the story to in greater detail. As you're writing this trauma narrative and you're preparing it, you're writing it down, you move forward with that, you fine tune it, you read it, you change it, you look at, am I saying this in a healthy way, that kind of stuff. Eventually, when you have a copy of this is what I think it should be, this is the healthiest version of telling the story, you're supposed to find that, to have that safe person. You sit down together and you read it to them. And so that's another aspect of that is considered to be quite healthy. What are some of the benefits of this? Well, one of the benefits is through talking it through and simply doing exposure. And I will say many people find this just naturally, even in a less structured talk therapy setting, is that it can reduce shame. If I talk about something, there is a dynamic that for many, not all, for many people, that if they are exposed, I mean, it's the reason why exposure therapy was very, very popular in CBT treatment and is still something that exists, is that exposure does tend to help us get used to something. And so if I've told the story more and more, there is a chance that it, will become a more regular part of my story. It may always be traumatic, obviously, but to have it be less overwhelming and just something that is a part of my story instead of something that defines me. And I think you'll find people who have been through the type of therapy where they do a trauma narrative, if they found it to be beneficial, they'll advocate for that this helped them to make the story less scary and less intimidating. And a lot of therapists who specialize in this particular type, that they would say the same thing and that they would talk about it. You do see people benefit from this and experience lots of healing. There are areas, in fact, where trauma-focused CBT, which includes the trauma narrative, of course, is the type of therapy that is, so let's say, permitted, or that it's been around long enough and the research about it is considered strong enough that if you are especially with state funding, and if the state has certain rules about that, they may actually require it if you're going to provide something. I was I've worked before with what they call the Children's Justice Centers in my area, which are wonderful organizations where people come in and they're able to bring their child in and talk about abuse that's happened. They'll even help them out with if they have to file police reports, or work with the Department of Child and Family Services and start to get some help. They have wonderful rooms and settings. They have stuffed animals and other things that can make the kids feel more comfortable. They'll allow you to even have a Child and Family Services worker come in and interview your child there in the facility. And they just do a lot of good for a lot of people. But for a time, if you were going to be on their list, of referral people that they would put on and say, oh, here's some therapists that you can look for in the community. You had to not only, certify that you would provide trauma-focused CBT, you had to go to their specific training to learn about it. And so, that's just an interesting thing of how much this dominated the field when it came to that. Nowadays, you find a lot more that are open to there's been other forms of research about EMDR and some of those other techniques that at the very least give people options. We can talk about maybe some other time. I'm not trying to introduce a debate over which is better. I have my own preferences and things, but one of the things that is a little tricky about a trauma narrative is that there is mixed research about that. It always was assumed that this is helpful for so many, so therefore it's just helpful. There is emerging research, this has been around for several years now, that some people actually respond better to not telling the story and not dwelling on it. That this actually could be a trigger for many people, and it could worsen their symptoms not only short term, but also long term. And the idea that you have to, quote, get it out, or else you never actually process it. There are people who process better without telling the story. And of course, therapies that don't require that can help that process. But there are people who just do better not talking about it as much and focusing on other things. Now, it's convenient if you are a person who doesn't have to talk about it, especially if that's the main therapy that is available, is talking about it. And it's like, I don't want to, so I'll just assume I'm one of those people. The way that that's always been measured in my training and my experience is that basically it has to do with the intensity and frequency of symptoms of PTSD. Are you having problems with nightmares? Are you having problems with irritability, increased substance use, or other unhealthy coping mechanisms? Are you afraid to go certain places? Are you developing agoraphobic or other anxiety disorder type symptoms? If you are, you're probably approaching it in a way that isn't your natural way to approach it. So if you're having a long-term or sustainable increase in those things, probably, pushing one's self into the trauma narrative thing, if that's what you're doing, is not right for you. Same thing as if you are not talking about it, and those things continue and add up and are happening more and more and less healthy, then you probably need to be talking about it, and it might just be avoidance. One pretty good study, if you want to learn more about this, is a big study that compiles a lot of research. I should say it's more of a study of studies, which is called Trauma Narratives. It's What You Say, Not How You Say It. By Jaeger, Lindblom, Parker Gilbert, and Zollner. Okay, this is something that came out in 2014, but it has a lot of information. This was, I think, during the height of this being one of the main things that you were doing and stuff. And so it has a lot of information about trauma narratives. There's a good book called Treating Trauma and Traumatic Grief in Children and Adolescents by Judith Cohen, Anthony Manarino, and Esther Deblinger. This was actually a textbook that was part of the training that I've gone through with trauma-focused CBT, even though I will say I still use elements of it, and there's really helpful things. One of the things that cognitive behavioral therapy offers is a deeper understanding of the way that our psychology interacts with our thoughts, behaviors, and our feelings. So that's there. I know there's a reason they still teach it and talk about it a lot. And I'm not going to say people don't use it. Modern therapy, especially if you're sitting there having talk therapy, it's a lot more influenced by this than it is by analysis, in my opinion. Psychoanalysis and some of those tools are also pretty present. Basically, when you're sitting and just talking about things in therapy and you're processing things, nowadays we don't use the word eclectic as much. That was another buzzword for a while. But it really is an eclectic mix of lots of different things. I myself have gravitated more towards less directive therapies, internal family systems, EMDR. I talk about those so much on the show, and you can find evidence rather you can find episodes of that if you go back in the timeline of what's come out. So I prefer those nowadays. And one of the reasons, tying back to some of the issues with trauma narratives, is that they do not necessarily require a lot of talking about what's happened. Theoretically, you can benefit from those interventions, even if you don't really tell the therapist why you're there. Now, that's pretty unusual, and I do believe people get something out of that verbal processing. But if someone just comes in and says, I'm having trauma symptoms, let's talk about what those are. How's it impacting my day-to-day? Let's do some exercises in EMDR. Let's do some IFS work that's focused on my emotional parts. They will still experience healing, and they might experience such strong healing that is similar to someone who talks a lot about it and processes a lot about it. So I guess that goes back to the difference that I mentioned before of, is it better for you to talk about it or not talk about it? Well, this allows for both. And even if you just don't want to talk about it, but maybe you're a person who naturally would benefit from talking about it, you can still have some benefit, even if you are having a hard time doing that. These are not perfect rules, by the way. There are a lot of people that practice, and there are a lot of patients out there who prefer cognitive behavioral therapy. So what this is, in my experience, in my opinion, is that treatment and therapy in general should be sort of a patchwork quilt of different diverse methods and things that are there, so that you can find what works best for you. And above all, the curative factors of therapy, what you do does tie in with research. What types of methods, you can pull up a lot of studies about what's the most effective method. However, the biggest curative factor is if you have a therapist who individualizes your treatment, who listens to you, who offers non-judgment. Essentially, if you feel safe having a teamwork approach with your therapist, then you are very likely to improve. That is more important than what they do. That's kind of funny, isn't it? What they do is important, but more important is if you have a safe teamwork type of relationship that allows you to start to heal. A lot of our healing does come from our own internal parts and our own internal processes. And if we are feeling safe to be able to have those, then, well, that's good. If you want to think about another non-directive type of therapy that helps with trauma, go back and look for the history lesson that we talked about play therapy. And there'll be some interviews with play therapists coming up as well in the main feed. I don't recall if the play therapy episode was one that is on the main feed. There may be a sample of it, if not, or it's maybe one that just you patrons can go back and find in the Patreon. So that's a little look at trauma narratives. There's lots more that could be said, and maybe we'll revisit that at some point. If you are interested in hearing every weekly history lesson, go to patreon.com/brokenbrain, or you can go to dwighthurst.com/support to find out different ways that you can support the program. We have some little sponsors who kick us a little bit here and there. If you use them with a purchase code, and you can also just sort of share the program with a friend. It doesn't cost anything if you are not if you're just not of the mindset to pay some money for it, or if you're in a situation where you can't. Either way, that's why I put so many things out for free. But if you would share the program with other people, it does help that as well, for the main reason I do this, which is to get information out there that may be helpful to people. I'll give you a quick mention of two things. Our charity of focus for this month of July is Munchausen syndrome. Go to munchausensyndrome.org. This organization helps to spread awareness for medical child abuse in the form of Munchausen by proxy syndrome and the effects of that, where a caregiver will exaggerate or manufacture medical problems in their child in order to obtain attention, or in order to obtain different emotional needs that they have, that they're satisfying through that abuse that they will perpetrate on their child. So it's a big problem, and it's one that isn't discussed as often as maybe it should be. So if you want to learn about it, you can go there for educational resources. You can even donate or get involved, or it can just let you know a little bit more about ways to address that. The second thing I want to mention real quick is that August 29th, that's a Thursday, at the end of August, there's only, typically 31 days in a month, right? So anyway, August 29th, I don't want to show off, but that's my understanding of calendars. There is going to be the third annual Broken Brain live feed. We're doing a 5-hour live feed to talk about and raise awareness for the International Opioid Overdose Awareness Day. We've been doing for 3 years now. We'll be joined by several people, and some of which I know are going to join, some of which I hope will join, and some of which I have no idea, but I still hope they will join. In other words, previous guests, friends of the program, people in general who I've reached out to, and some who have committed, and some who will just join. You can join. Anyone can join as well. If you go to dwighthurst.com/live, you will find links to the social media outlets where you can watch this live feed or listen to it. And also there will be a link right on that page that will pop up right before the live feed will happen, to where you can join the show live as well. It's sort of a live call-in feature, except you'll be part of the call, part of the broadcast, and just welcome anybody who wants to say anything that has to do with addiction, with mental health, with just awareness that you would like to put out there about that as well. And really just anything at all. If you feel like you have nothing to say, you're still welcome to jump on, and you can ask questions of whatever experts there. We can chat about it, and we can, just appreciate you. You can join any amount of time, from 1 minute all the way up to hours if you want to. We'll just go with it. The focus for this year's live stream is going to be relapse, the dynamics of relapse prevention, relapse protection, and also relapse recovery when relapse does happen, because it happens sometimes. Thanks again for being there. Y'all are great. Glad to share this with you. Hope that it's helpful in the way that you think about trauma and when you approach looking for your own trauma therapy, or that for your loved ones as well.